So this is really special because I just came in last night from a group in San Diego. Y'all may be familiar with the Parish Collective, but it's a group of people who is about 5 years ahead of the work that we're doing here. So I was with them in the way that you guys are today, to hear story and see what's kind of going on in the San Diego area. So it's neat to get to be with all of you. We are in this place this morning. The congregation will meet in here at 10:30. That is not normal, but the reality of stewarding an old building means that the entire AC system may go out and you just have to flex with it. So that's been a consistent part of our journey here as we try to figure out what to do with this space. Charis is the Greek word for grace. And that word is special to us because in the 1970s, a preacher named Roy Osborne was the first Church of Christ preacher to preach grace. People would come from all over the city, some from across the country, to hear this revolutionary concept that God extended grace to all of us. Unfortunately, through that time, the church expanded. The church grew and grew and grew because they came to see this dynamic preacher, but never really grew to be a part of the neighborhood. So while the church was growing and expanding, it was actually just focused inward on itself and building this monument instead of building mission. So that's kind of the context around, we wanted to name what we felt like we could promise to people, and that was grace, and what we were hoping we would receive back. And then also be true to the DNA of who we are as a people of grace. But I feel like it's important to give a little bit of the history. You sit in a chapel built in the early 1930s by the Woodmen of the World. This was commissioned to be the chapel for the tuberculosis hospital that sat on the property. This chapel was used, and then the new sanctuary was built. And then through all of these different myths and stories, some of them are a bit of a legend, this place got kind of closed up. So one of the stories is that there was a gold cross that sat back on that table under this is a Tiffany glass window, if you're familiar with Tiffany, the River of Life. There is one of these in the Met Gallery, also its sister window. So there's a gold cross that sat on the table back there, and a group was in here because it was open. The cross was stolen, and the myth is that then the chapel was closed up. The big cedar trees were planted out front in sort of this Beauty and the Beast style legend that the chapel was then kind of hidden. So this place has sat empty kind of for decades, was pretty much used only for weddings, and got to the place where the weddings were only allowed to happen if you were a member here. So if any of you work in the church, which I know you do, you can imagine that some people placed membership for 6 months so they could have their wedding in the beautiful chapel, and then, not the mission that we're hoping for, right? So this commuter church that's focused inward went through some changes in the 80s, and it began this steady decline. And the really steep decline started in the 2010s. In 2017, the church leadership, which included myself as one of 3 ministers, all of the elders and our spouses, came together asking the questions, what does God intend for us to do with this place that is steadily declining? We began the process of seeking outside help through consultants from both Harding University and Abilene Christian. We had a man named Dr. Carlos Gupton who came in and showed us the organizational bell curve. And so if you're familiar, it looks like this, and they say an organization in growth is going up here, and then it reaches its peak. And so in order to continue to grow, it's kind of got to do a loop and do something radically different, and then it keeps going up. And what Carlos shared with us was that our organization was all the way down here, one step away from death, basically. And that moment of being in the room when you have all of these people, some of our elders who had been elders for 30 plus years, our minister who had been a minister here for 40 years, being told that this place, this home that we have is dying. There was no air left in the room. The wind was knocked out of everyone. And I've heard stories from other congregations who have been through a similar situation. And when that happened in the room, they decided to, one story was that the elders said, don't ever bring a person like that again. We're not going to listen and we're not going to make these changes. And thankfully, our elders were brought to their knees and decided to do some really courageous things. So Carlos said that we had three options: legacy the church, which meant that we were going to just let the decline happen, do it slowly and quietly, continue the faithful stewardship of the current congregation until there was no congregation anymore, sell the property and give it to some mission. Bring a planting group in, so people who do this for their work and vocation come in and plant a new plant from outside of us, or look at a social enterprise model like y'all are doing through Rooted Good. We had 32 members of the congregation that formed the vision team. It was led by 3 members of the congregation who were not in formal leadership roles. And we went through an 18-month process with the help of Good Acres, with the help of the Make Good Fellowship and other people, to identify the assets, resources, gifts, and needs that we had. So a group would go out, on a task, come back and present. So we did this for 18 months. All while I was finishing my master's in global leadership at Fuller. So this is kind of all happening at the same time in the way that God does these things. So November 2020, a report was given to the elders by the vision team recommending that we go forward with a hybrid model. So we would plant inside of ourselves this missional community that came from within us that would also be a social enterprise. Because a few things were crystal clear in this vision process. The first was a radical and rapid change needed to happen. Regeneration from within the current congregation would have been too disruptive to the congregation. It was a step too far because our church was aging. These are people that generationally had been a part of this congregation. And the neighborhood was exactly the opposite of our church. So the neighborhood looked like young, single, professional people, single mothers, single parents. The congregation looked like people over 60s, all in pretty, married children type of families. We also allowed our 30,000 plus square foot building to sit empty, 6 days out of the week. So everything we were doing was about the programming for this group of people, never outside into the neighborhood, with the exception of a vacation Bible school, right? So we presented this to the congregation. People were invited to come forward as they felt called to be a part of this work. And the commitment was clear. It was going to be incredibly time consuming. It was going to be a big commitment, and we had about a handful of people, at the beginning 4 people to be exact, who were willing to commit to doing this. So from April to August, we worked with consultants, tons of prayer, research, again, Make Good Fellowship, help from our friends at Impact Guild and Good Acres, to birth this Charis collective that we have here today, discerning the mission and vision and values and our unique calling to this particular neighborhood. So we presented this plan to the elders in late August of last year, and then the congregation, and have been working ever since on what you'll see here today. I think it's important to note, for the context that y'all might be in, that so I was the family minister, children's minister first, then family minister of 7 years by the time that this started. So our eldership made the very courageous step to say, we will commission you to go spend the majority of your time working on this work, and we'll backfill that family minister position. And in the meantime, we'll support it with volunteers and other things. We had our senior minister of 42 years who was also in retirement, So when I say courageous and faithful and brave for our leadership to say that all of this can happen, all this disruption, and we're going to support it and kind of help walk through it, it really was incredible. So we were given resources through our foundation. We have a foundation that was gifted to the church years ago to hire 2 part-time support staff, a community curator, and a collective coordinator. So both a programs director, community builder, networking type of person, and a very gifted, organized administrator. We have a leadership team at Charis that reports to the elders of Sunset Ridge, and a document that clearly defines the boundaries and expectations of our relationships with one another, which has been really critical in this journey. So Charis Collective is a group of people working for the flourishing of one another and our neighborhood. At the core of what we do, we believe that God desires goodness for each person. And so we center this around holistic spirituality, including mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health, and relational health. Don't want to forget that one. This is kind of a radical step, because if you're familiar with the Church of Christ, you might know that it is a very intellectual, theological denomination. So to say things like holistic spirituality was kind of a radical thing, that we say, hey, we believe that God cares about the whole person. We live out this mission of goodness and flourishing through a number of different ways. Right now, this looks like delivering snack packs to a local elementary school every Thursday so children have food on the weekend. At that same elementary school, we support a teacher who started a leadership drum line. We host teacher appreciation events. We do a big Christmas, affordable Christmas program for parents. We work with Christian Assistant Ministries at their homeless shelter for the unsheltered population. And we have 3 different forms of worship that we do here with Charis. So every Sunday morning, Sunset Ridge Church of Christ meets in our traditional Church of Christ worship service. And then at 4:30, we have 3 different ways that we worship throughout the month. So once a month, we do a supper church, which you may be familiar with. You'll get to be out in our courtyard later today. That's where we host supper church. People come together to cook a meal and dine together and break bread over communion. We have an outdoor worship service. I heard that y'all were with Charlie yesterday, or had some root beer from Charlie yesterday, right? So this month, our outdoor worship service was root beer and hymns out on the front. So we had Charlie's root beer on tap and did root beer floats and worship. We also do a liturgy and worship here in the chapel. And what we found is that I have neighbors that I'll sit and talk to over a cup of coffee who say things like, I'm happy to sit and talk to you, but I will never step foot into the church. And I'm like, that's great, no problem. We have other people who say, I don't want to come into the church, but I'll come to supper church because I love to cook. Or we'll have some who say, I'm going to bring my family to outdoor worship, but they never come into the chapel. So our intention is to honor kind of different ways of people experiencing God's presence and have some different entry points to do that. We have a weekly story time that that is with our family minister, Chelsea Sturman, and takes place out on the front lawn. So moms will walk up with their kids and do a story and a craft and hang out and have coffee. So that's in collaboration with Rose Hip. And then neighborhood events. The Rose Hip story is one that I think is really special and it has been consistently a marker for us of how we think we come in with these plans, right? We did a ton of research. Like, we spent so much time and energy, and so we had all of these plans. And one of our plans was to have a coffee truck. You can't walk to coffee in this neighborhood, and everyone walks in this neighborhood. So like, well, we got to have coffee then. So that's in our plan. We're going to build out this coffee truck someday. And I get this email from a young woman named Katie Bess Richmond, who I didn't know at the time. And she says, I'm driving around praying about where I could park my coffee truck. I have this mission. And my mission is to break bread over a cup of coffee with a neighbor and build bridges in this neighborhood. And I live 2 blocks away from your church, and I saw your parking lot. And so I got on the website, and I just emailed the friendliest looking face on there. And as the sole woman at that time on the website, I think that may have been a part of it. Sole woman and sole person under 50 on the website. And so she sends me this whole email, and I respond right away and like, let's grab coffee tomorrow and talk about this. So I'm sitting at this coffee shop with her, and I'm just listening. I'm like, tell me, how did this happen? Tell me what you're thinking. And she goes through this whole thing, and I say, what did you know about what we were doing? And she said, I didn't know anything. I had just heard in passing when I was at the Impact Guild, somebody said Sunset Ridge, and so I figured if you knew Sarah, you were probably okay. Okay. And so I tell her this vision of this community park, of this place where the neighbors can gather, and we both just start crying because God had planted this vision. Both of us sent her to us before we even knew we needed her. Because frankly, we weren't ready for her. We were like, when we have the park, then we'll have coffee, and this is how our plan will go. And God's like, that's really cute. Yeah. So here comes Katie, and we're like, do we have to get zoning? Do we have to, we don't know. And so we started that process. We've learned a lot. My husband says, your resume is going to look pretty great after this because you learned a lot of things you didn't know how to do before. And so here comes Katie, and I call Katie the Cheers neighborhood bartender because, people just talk to her and they come, and all of a sudden, in 1 month, I know more neighbors from this little coffee trailer than I ever did before. And so God has continued to do that for us. And we say, we had all these plans and we did all of this work, but really the big stuff that's happened hasn't been anything we've done. Our role has just kind of been to get out of the way and be open to it. So we will go outside in a bit to look at what we call affectionately Charis Park. So this 1 acre of concrete that's going to be transformed into a community park in a neighborhood that, as you might have noticed, is surrounded by apartments. There is a great deal of loneliness we learned in the neighborhood, especially post-COVID, right? Or during COVID. People have been isolated, they're in apartment buildings, not a lot of interaction. So Charis Park is birthed out of this desire for presence and hospitality and to care well for the earth that God created. Because right now, it's just a heat radiant surface. It's not doing any good. And so to be able to transform that into native plants and cool soil and create this oasis for respite for people. There will be a multi-purpose space of gathering areas, a pergola for weddings, a place to encourage movement and engagement with nature. So we have these amazing architects, but we chose them based on their shared value of creation care. That was something that was really important to us. In addition, we will have what we call Charis Co-working. So this idea was birthed out of our own Make Good Fellowship, this social enterprise that will create dignified vocational training for under-resourced and underemployed women. So that's at the heart of what we're building out or what we're working toward. This idea came from one of our Make Good experiences, and I myself am an adoptive mother to a little girl who was adopted out of foster care from a woman who was not able to care for her children, to have the support and resources that she needed to be able to get out of her cycle. And so when we were asked to imagine a person who was impacted by our work, I saw my daughter's birth mother and thought, what would it take to make it so she could have cared for her children and had dignifying employment and felt supported and surrounded. And so we have this beautiful chapel. Everybody wants to get married in here. And we have all of this space. So how do we bring all of those things together on mission? And so that is the kind of long-term vision of where we're hoping to go. So in the meantime, we will work on building renovations, hopefully have working air conditioning, and get to the place where we're training in floral design, photography, all of these different areas of events, and then have sustainable income for a woman who didn't have it before, all while providing childcare on site. So our co-working will be the only one in San Antonio that has childcare. We will ask that participating vendors and missional partners teach and offer workshops to these women. And then we will prioritize this cohort, these cohort members as vendors for the events is the big picture. The hope is that this missional hub creates more goodness in the community. And we also intend to prioritize locally sourced vendors and foods. If we cater anything, we do it through Mission Bell, our friends over at Alamo Heights United Methodist, root beer from Charlie. You know, we really just try to keep the dollar in the neighborhood as much as we can. So for us, one of the visions that we had early on is this looks like we have a local flower farm. We buy our wedding flowers from the local flower farm. They're designed by a local woman. When the wedding's over and all of these things typically get trashed, we split them up into arrangements for the neighborhood and just love on our neighbors, who then can bring them back here because we have compost queens on site. So it's a whole, you know, this kind of whole cycle of keeping what we're doing right here inside. Our desire is to be neighbor-led in all of this process. So what this looks like is holding a tension between institution and this work that we're doing. When we worked with Good Acres on the park team, we had members of the congregation and neighbors as people who decided what the elements of the park were going to be. We put up boards at our community yard sale and had neighbors vote on what they wanted to see in their park. We do simple things. You might have noticed the back of our church sign, like inviting our neighbors to write our church sign for us. If any of you are familiar with El Arroyo Instagram, we're like, send us your ideas, and we pick one and we post it up on the church sign. A group of neighbors will also be a part of the revitalization of our main building. One note that I wanted to share with y'all that has been really important to me in this work, because I've had people say, how many people come to your worship service? And I'm like, I mean, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, sometimes 50, you know, it just depends. Well, how do you know you're being successful, right? That's always the question. How do you measure this work? And so we've chosen to name goodness every single time we see it. So for us, this looks like a neighbor who says, I used to be afraid of Christians, but I'm not afraid to talk to you. I'm not afraid of Christians anymore. This looks like a person who says, I get up in the morning because there's a coffee truck and people I can sit with, and I don't feel so lonely anymore. So we name those things as markers of signposts of where God's at work and to keep us going. And I just wanted to share that because I know how daunting this work is and how isolating this work is, and how many people you have who want to say, well, how are you going to sustain this, and how are you going to build that? And I will talk very briefly on that piece because I realized I skipped over it because the money part, right? It's like, keep doing the mission part. That's more fun. We do have a foundation. We're very fortunate to have that. It is limited. It will not fund all of the work that we're doing, and it is what funds the salaries of everybody who's on staff with Charis. So there is a kind of limit on what we're able to do with that. We are pursuing fundraising, so that's a process that we're in the middle of right now. But we're also learning through Sarah and others this idea of diverse revenue streams, so that we have a co-working space that utilizes this building, this missional hub piece, that is projected to earn somewhere around $16,000 or $17,000 a month in income. So that supports the church facilities, right? These event rentals, these weddings, these receptions, all of this is how we will work to build this out in phases and then support this work long term. So our senior minister, John, of 42 years, obviously had great respect of the congregation. And he took us through a book by Todd Bolsinger called Canoeing the Mountains. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but excellent book. He did a sermon series on canoeing the mountains. And what he said was the canoe that you had before, you're going to have to leave it aside because you're going to a new place now. So the congregation has been on this journey for 5 years of learning. They have seen the bell curve. They have done workshops. They have gone through this. And even with all of that, we still very much have people who maybe trying to evangelize at the coffee truck, or, you know, well-meaning, trying to get people into church. So it's just been requiring a lot of patience and a lot of listening, and some people who aren't going to understand why all of you are out here when there's a worship service going on in there. So you should be in there, right? You know, some of that is, you know, it's just been navigating that with as much grace as possible, and with the help of our leadership and good teaching around it. Right now they're doing the Good and Beautiful Community book. So we have a lot of support from our leadership in trying to keep walking people along. We had this adorable plan. We had a sign that was actually, the picture was taken right here, that said, Charis Park coming spring 22. Okay, right? No park yet, right? And so we had all of these big ideas. And if you're familiar with Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 8 with a 7 wing. My partner in crime, who is not here today because of a COVID exposure, is an Enneagram 3. And then our coordinator is an Enneagram 9. So we're like, let's get stuff done. And the 9's like, absolutely, I will help you do that, you know. So we had this big vision, and what we've learned is this is all really slow, small, incremental work. And we had the thought at one point that we couldn't start any of it until the park was here. But then Katie came, right? And it was like, okay, well, when the park comes, we'll do a family story time. When the park comes, we'll do a market. When the park comes, and God's like, but the people are right here now. So what does it look like to start small, do little things? Our services that I mentioned, the different forms of worship, we're just iterating. I mean, and we have the freedom to be able to do that, to say, hey, let's try this outdoor worship thing. Hey, let's add some root beer and try to do some hymns. You know, just constantly coming back and reassessing and giving each other really direct feedback. And that didn't really resonate with anybody, or wasn't kind of what we were hoping. And then we start all over again and do it again. So just to kind of name that there have been, we now have a family story time because we put out some blankets on the lawn in this grass, right? It doesn't, our co-working space is not the full build out of the whole building, you know, and even with this missional wedding concept, we're going to just start that small and bring in vendors and bring in one woman who's a photographer to train, you know, just do it really small and faithful steps, right? So
early on you said something about, we learned that there was a lot of loneliness in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk in a little bit of detail, like specifically how you learned that information.
Honestly, most of it was through coffee. It was just noticing that there was this same woman coming up, you know, every day by herself, and just starting to talk to her and listen to her story. And she lives in the apartments by herself. And Katie identified, oh, there's a woman who's a widow who lives in the apartments. Wait, this other customer is a widow who lives in the apartments. Let me introduce them. And they meet every morning for coffee together. They started like buying each other's coffee, like when the other one wasn't there. And so it's been through those things, just kind of listening, you know, getting out of that building, which I will tell you is one of my biggest struggles, because I go right into like work mode and project mode. And we got a lot of big work we got to do, when my calling is to be sitting with our neighbors, you know, and so I'm still learning how to balance that.
And then the other one was, at one point you said when everything's fleshed out with the wedding stuff, mm-hmm. that it'll bring in about $17,000 a month. And I wonder if you could talk in a little detail how you came to that number.
That piece is the co-working, that's the missional hub. That was with the work that we did with Good Acres, and using their models of saying, all right, we've got this room that's this many square feet, we can rent it, we can have a membership that is private office space for this much a month. We just took the entire blueprint of the facility and said, what does it look like to really use our space in that way, including a ghost kitchen, commercial kitchen, because again, we got this beautiful kitchen that just sits there during the week.
I'm kind of curious with all of like the exploration and the different, you're experimenting, right? And so how do you continue to get word out through all that? Because sometimes it takes a while to build those things, but to have people to come.
Yeah, no, that's really true. Our word of mouth through the neighbors has been kind of our very best tool. We've identified people of peace in the neighborhood, and we build relationships. And I say we've identified, it's 100% been God, bringing people along that we meet who we call a part of our community, though they probably will never be in our worship service, but they're friends. And we say, hey, there's this thing. And now this place that was this monument that nobody knew about, the neighbors have told us, oh, we just assumed nobody even met there anymore, that this was just a beautiful building. They call it the church. So neighbors will text each other and go, hey, what's happening at the church today? Social media is the other way. So our collective coordinator, Noelle, she's young and incredibly gifted on social media. And then Taylor, our community curator, has graphic design and art background. So we've got a number of people in the community who do really cool social stuff. So yeah, but mostly relationships. So that 1 acre of concrete is right over there. The beautiful thing is the Red Cross used to have a building on that property. And then our church, when it was originally planted, met in the Red Cross building. So there's kind of this healing, that has taken place on this land, which we think is really beautiful. So what you're looking at right there on the board to the right, that's about the perspective of the park. So we'll have a crosswalk that goes across, entrance. The coffee trucks will be over there under the trees with this beautiful community table. So our outdoor service will take place under this pavilion, among many other things. This Main Street walkway is about 10 feet wide, so when we do markets and things, they will actually take place kind of across that. And then there's a whole great big circle. So there's a prayer labyrinth back here. The other images are inside. There's a prayer labyrinth back here. And then this is the wedding pergola where we're going to have outdoor services.
We ended up creating a rubric of like 11 elements that were really important, that this group decided were really important to see in the park. They decided a traditional play structure is not actually something we're looking for, but we'd like to see elements that kids can climb on and interact with, but that mirror nature a little bit more. So that's one of the 11. These wandering, meandering paths, a big place pavilion and open field that can support and work with the wedding industry side of things here as that continues. And we just named those elements, and you all also named some of the intangibles that were then put into an RFP, a request for proposal. How do we have enough direction of the mission and where things are headed for a project to invite the right partners to the table, but also not so much that it feels rigorous and rigid and there can't still be some design in that. And so that's been an interesting learning in this process of how could we get enough of that together to then put out. We did asked a pre-qualified set of landscape architects of 3, or we end up with 4 different landscape architects to then respond to that RFP with their proposals, and had a rubric for evaluation. But also you guys met Coral, the guys that are doing this, and we're just like, they're the fit. And because you've done several months of hard work to identify where the value sets were and where the environmental stewardship piece and the actual elements you were looking to create, then the right development partner was a much clearer choice and kind of solved for itself. So I just think with where so many of us are in our projects, that is kind of a helpful, and I know that can be a mystifying process that we've been saying we're kind of learning along the way, but I think by intentionally inviting partners into that and bringing, kind of balancing this art and science side to it, it then allowed the ability to invite the right professionals to the table and move forward from there.
So Katie's truck was over here. That's why there's seating and an awning. So in the city of San Antonio, the health code says that a food truck cannot have seating and an awning next to it, unless it's in a licensed food truck park. So when we went through the city for rezoning the park, so we could have 2 food trucks on it, we could have markets, we could do all of that. Neighborhood commercial was the zoning that we went to. The city councilman said, but I don't want a food truck park there. Yep, that's not what we're wanting to do. No more than 2. Okay, no problem. Somebody called on Katie and said, hey, she's operating without a food truck park permit and she has chairs and an awning. And so the health department said she has to move across the street. And I said, well, what's the distance? Like what? Well, there isn't one. But so that's been a very interesting process. And in the way that God works, in the meantime, a neighbor who I'd only met at the coffee truck comes along with this mission called guerrilla gardening. And she says she had hired a landscape architect to design these couple little areas. And she comes and says, would it be okay if I did this here just as a gift for the church? And it's going to have built-in seating and this. And we're like, so there's the loophole. It's our seating and it's built in. And so the food truck can be there. I mean, this came out of nowhere, so.
Because this donor is giving the seating to the church and it's permanent seating, it no longer falls under that same code. So Katie's not setting that up. So
Right.
It was this
It's the
complete
church's.
God moment that once the plants are planted and the seating's in place, she's going to be able to move the food truck back over here and have seating next to it and satiate the city's requirement.
Yeah. The only resistance we had was the fear of if the zoning turned to commercial, then if the church was gone, could somebody buy it? Because I'm told, I don't know, I have not confirmed this, but I'm told that this is the last full acre of undeveloped land in Alamo Heights. So it's a very big deal to have this property. And so they're going, somebody's going to want to buy that up. And so we worked with the neighborhood, and a lot of that was through Nextdoor or holding meetings here, and said, okay, we'll drop it down to neighborhood commercial, which really limits what's allowed to eventually be there. We had to do the work to count the number of parking spaces over here to make sure we were at the right capacity, because there's actually 120 on this side of the property because it goes all the way back there too. So a lot of phasing that's taking place. We just hold the dream and then see what happens.